I was assigned here to talk on small ruminants. You know, we've had some good talks this morning about goats and sheep for vegetation management. I had a talk about controlling parasites, which are important. And I'm going to talk in general about management of the animal. And we'll have another talk then about vegetation management. But I'm going to just talk about managing the animals, sheep and goats, and particularly looking at hair sheep. Okay, why sheep or goats? Why do you want to get in with goats or sheep? They're suited to small farms. If you got 12 acres, you can't put very many cattle on them. Seniors, when you get to be my age, you don't feel like wrestling with a chute. And for women. So they're very amenable to a lot of us. There's a good meat market. I saw something just recently. Sheep are right up close to $2 a pound. Goats are up close to $3 a pound now. Of course, it's a wonderful season for selling small ruminants right now when no one has them. Low startup costs. You don't have to buy a big chute and a big corral and a barn and this, that, and the other for sheep or goats when you start out. Co-species grazing, those of y'all that have cattle or horses already, you can put sheep or goats under them to control the brush and weeds, save on spraying costs, have another income stream. Early puberty and reproduce at a high rate. Most of your small ruminants will produce young at about a year of age, and when they are mature, they generally will twin quite a bit. So this means you can start out with a few sheep or goats, and 6 or 7 years you've got too many. Some of the profitable niches are vegetation control on unused land, which has been talked about this morning, will be talked about later. Control of brush, weeds, Sericea lespedeza. Can be integrated with cropping systems, and that's something we've kind of forgotten about. There was a lot of research from the 30s up to the 50s on crop rotations with pasture. And we seem to have forgotten about that. And they discovered that, golly, when land came out of pasture for a couple of years and then went into crops, you had a tremendous increase in yield. Also, you can graze cover crops. You know, there's a lot of hassle, and we've got a cover crop here. We've got to somehow get rid of the biomass so that we can plant into it then. Well, sheep or goats can consume the biomass and produce fertilizer for it. And they can also graze a number of crop residues. If you're a homesteader, they can provide meat for the family. They can provide milk, cheese, yogurt, and soap. If you're into spinning, Angora goats or wool sheep can provide fiber for spinning. Can be a companion animal, which a number of people are into sheep and goats as hobbies, and they usually have one or two pets or maybe a dozen pets. Run a goat nursing home. Some of the resource requirements doesn't require a lot of resources. Some sort of windbreak or shade, and part of it depends on where you're at in the country. We of course have to have some sort of fencing, and especially with goats, you've got to have some sort of source of water, and most importantly, land somehow, whether rented, borrowed, or whatever. And then which small ruminant? Goats are suitable for brush, also companion animal. I was talking to a lady last night that had goats, and she talked about how she liked their personalities as compared to the sheep. Sheep, you can have hair or wool sheep, which are best for grass or weeds. Your hair sheep tend to be better browsers. Dairy goats to provide milk for your family. Cashmere goats, wool sheep, or Angora goats for fiber. How many of y'all have sheep? Okay, and how many of y'all have goats? I'm afraid the sheep people may outnumber us. going to talk briefly about sources of sheep and goat information. Individual producers, of course, are probably the most important source of information. Hate to say it, but I think people are top the internet as far as being important sources because many things are not on the internet. Producers groups, there's often sheep or goat clubs, state level clubs, and there are breed groups. University and Extension, which there's several of us here today, and the internet. Should point out ATRA this morning has some material here on the table, a very good source of information. And I did bring some some meat goat and dairy goat handbooks and Katahdin sheep handbook. At the break you can look at them, and they're actually for sale. And I have order forms if you don't want to buy them. Okay, as I said, producers are the most important source of information. Find out why they have sheep or goats in their particular situation. What's your animal management plan? Breeding season, kidding date, weaning, pastures, fence, wintering, predators. And unfortunately, you'll find out most people don't really have a plan. They might know some things out of the top of their head, but I think it's important for a person to sit down and put together a plan. What's their health program, vaccination, what diseases do they have, treatment, prevention, and worms, where do they sell their animals at, what are their animal facilities. Producers groups, you can locate breed associations and clubs on the internet. Like I said, I have the Katahdin hair sheep publication on managing hair sheep. There are some, I guess the Dorper website has about 3 pages on that. Excuse me, the St. Croix. The Dorper website, I couldn't find any information on managing those. But it's a good place also to meet other producers. Good place to participate in educational activities. Many of them will have training sessions on various things, such as parasite control. You can locate sources of animals. You know, the best source of animals is not on the internet. You don't find out enough information on them. But however, if you go on producers' farms and visit producers and find someone that has the type of management you want to be involved in. For instance, show animals won't fit very well on your farm if you're having animals for brush or weed control. There are many producers groups that have websites and just use the Katahdins for a source. The Dorper people do, American Boer Goat Association, Savannah Goat Association. So there's many sources of information on the web, but it's like anything else, not everything on the web is true. And so you have to be a little bit cautious. If you find extension people have to be responsible for their information, as do breed associations. There are also a few private groups that have good websites, and we'll talk about some of them later. Most states have a sheep and goat specialist, or sheep or goat specialist, that can provide you information. There are some local, county level extension educators that may have knowledge, may have their own sheep or goats, for instance, and if they've had them a while, they've become knowledgeable. Or they may know one in the next county or 2 counties over that has expertise with those species. University websites, such as the Langston website there that we've listed. I talked about the meat and dairy goat handbooks here. About 400 pages of information, so that at least you'll develop a vocabulary for talking about sheep and goat problems. And as I mentioned earlier, the ATRA material that is there and also on their website. Visit sheep and goat auctions. It's a good place to meet other producers. It's a good place to find out what do sheep and goats sell for, what are quality factors that buyers look for, find out some about the seasonal price patterns, what to look for in an animal, but it's not the best source of breeding animals, because most of the animals that are at an auction are there for a reason, and it's not written on their side. And most of them are most suited for meat and not for breeding animals. Lots of good information and disinformation on the web. Some there's no responsibility. Some people have one experience and think it applies to the whole sheep world. That ain't necessarily so. University and breed organizations are your most reliable sources. They're list servers for goat, meat goats, wool sheep, hair sheep. Also the E-Extension website has information on it. Maryland website, sheepandgoat.com, also a good source of information. So there's many sources of good information out there on the web. Just be careful which ones you trust. Going to talk about important considerations in sheep and goat production. Matters not what country you're in. I talked to a fellow from Australia, and he told me that these were also the 3 most important things in Australia. Parasites or worms, predators. There's 10,000 coyotes that think that lamb is the best, and fencing. Goats like to see what the world is like over from the neighbor's perspective. Predator problems. The biggest predator problem you'll have most likely will be the neighborhood dogs. 1 dog is no problem, 2 dogs are a hunting pack. And they get in there and one's got to show how he can kill this animal, then the other one has to one-up him, and then he has to one-up the other one. And so, a coyote will kill 1 to eat, but your neighborhood dogs will kill 6 or 8 showing off. Coyotes are a problem. Not every coyote is a bad coyote. As long as you never let that coyote taste how good sheep and goat are, and he respects your fence and stays out, we're all right. If you kill those good coyotes, a bad coyote might move in that will try your lamb or goat. Some of your less common predators include bobcats, cougars, wolves, bear, feral pigs, an up-and-coming predator problem. Eagles, of course, black-headed vultures, ravens, and it seems like the guard dogs know a little bit less about the aerial predators, so they can be a real problem. Some ways that we can protect from predators. Guard dogs are the most popular. Yes, guard dogs require us to feed them dog food, and that amounts to about almost between $200 and $300 a year. Basically, I added up the expenses of a guard dog for a year, and you're looking at $300 to $400 a year for a guard dog. By the time you pay for his annual vaccinations, you amortize his purchase price, and buy him dog food. But guard dogs are the most successful at predator prevention. Donkeys and llamas will work. Donkeys seem to have a pretty good reputation. They're not as successful as dogs, but they can work. They have an advantage in that they don't require dog food. They eat what the goats eat. You can put your animals in a night lot, kind of like closing them up in a bedroom at night, because that's when most of the kills happen. However, your predators at times can get smart to that. But you put them into a dog-proof fenced enclosure, then to keep the predators away from them during the night. Electric fence can sure help you. Canines hate to get shocked. And so basically, if you can put your electric fence up, the predators will learn to avoid that area. However, once they get a taste of lamb or goat, there's a strong incentive to endure the shock of electric fence to get a tasty meal. That's how good that meat is. And so if you can put up the fence and try to never let your predators taste how good lamb or goat is. Federal trapper can come in and trap the animals out as a last resort. Internal parasites, and Dahlia gave a real good talk this morning on parasites, so I've just got 2 slides here to go through. You need to have a worm control program. Our biggest problem in sheep and goats is dewormer resistance. That our worms just love those dewormers. It's like 3S's or some other stimulant. It doesn't kill them. Some things we can do, we can cull the wormy animals. As Dahlia said, 20% of our sheep and goats produce 80% of the eggs on pasture. So you'll do everyone a favor if you can cull those. Fecal egg counts or checking the eye color with FAMACHA. Internal parasite workshop is probably the best investment if you're going to be a new producer or if you're a fairly new producer. And usually most states have them. We have one at Langston that's scheduled in May, but there's a number of states that have a significant component of sheep or goats that do have internal parasite workshops. But as one parasitologist said, you need to know more about your worm farm than you do your sheep or goat farm if you're going to be successful at raising them. Don't graze close to the ground. Those infective larvae are close to the ground. Have a moderate stocking rate. The more you stock animals on there, the more poop, the more eggs, the more larvae, the more mouths picking up the larvae. So we have to go with a moderate stocking rate, which also helps us to keep animals from grazing close to the ground. We can do rotational grazing. We need to have a rest period at longer than 35 days, and it depends on where you're at. In the north, they talk about 60 to 90 days rest period. And the south, when we have 100-degree days, we can get by with about 35, 40 days of rest. Making hay on pastures. If we cut those pastures and make hay, we've removed most of the infective larvae in the hay, where they will die in short order. And so that pretty much cleans the pasture off. Sericea lespedeza and browse help. The Sericea lespedeza has tannins in it that are very good for parasite control. Basically, after feeding Sericea lespedeza about 5 days, fecal egg counts are reduced by over 50%. Longer term feeding that will reduce the actual worms in the animal. Browse, they're not eating close to the ground, so they're not picking up infective larvae. And basically, almost all the studies that we've done with goats for vegetation management where there was adequate browse, we've never had to deworm a goat. So if we can keep animals eating high away from the ground, that's going to help us on worms. Some breeds and individuals are more resistant to worms than others. And here's a good source of information right here that was mentioned this morning by Dahlia. Showing a FAMACHA card there and the eye color, the color of the lower eyelid right here where it was touching the eye. One of our major worms causes anemia because he sucks blood. And so, but it's a tropical worm. So it's a problem, as Susan Shanian says, if it's baseball season, it's barber pole worm season. And so we need to watch the eye color then for the animal. Your other temperate species worms do not cause anemia, which makes their diagnosing them a little more difficult. Fencing is going to be your biggest expense, more so than your animals even. Just some prices there for a net wire fence, the sheep and goat wire. There's a high tensile version of sheep and goat wire that's a little more expensive, but it is high tensile wire, so it springs back after you take the tree that's fallen onto it off of it. Electric fence, we can control goats very well with electric fence, 4 strands, 30 inches high. Hair sheep people talk about 3 strands. And it's much cheaper. We're talking about $2,000 per mile. Okay, that is sheep and goat wire that has narrow openings here and bigger openings as we go up. And our vertical wires are 12 inches apart. So when our animals stick their head through, their horns keep them from pulling it back, but there's enough space they can get their nose around and pull their head back out. People will often stick a strand of barbed wire on top of it to keep cattle or horses from sticking their neck over. Some people use a strand of barbed wire at the bottom, trying to keep predators out. If we're converting old fences, such as we have a good 5-strand barbed wire fence, we can add 3 extra strands of barbed wire and stays then, or we can use 1 or 2 strands of electric wire on the outriggers, and I'll show you some of that. Okay, here's 5-strand barbed wire fence that we've added 3 strands of wire to. Basically, you don't want to space any wider than 7 inches up to about this high, because you'll have your animals get through it. Here's 2 electric wires on outriggers on front of a 5-strand barbed wire fence. Those wires need to be about roughly 10 and 20 inches high, will do for goats. And there's 4 strands for hot wire there. Some rules for successful use of electric fence. An electric fence doesn't work successfully for all people because they don't follow these rules. Number 1 is put it up with quality materials. Your neighborhood farm store often doesn't have quality materials because everyone wants cheap, right? And cheap may not be quality. Find somebody that's got experience using electric fence for a long period of time and get with them to learn where they get their materials from and construction techniques. Train your animals to it before you put them out. Have some net wire fence trap. Put a sample of your electric fence across the corner and throw a bale of hay over on the other side. Anything to get those animals to test the fence. And goats are smart. Not everyone will have to touch it. They'll learn from others' mistakes. Shame we humans don't do that. Sheep learn very well too. Okay, then after you put animals out, check the fence daily and keep 4,500 volts on it. And that's the secret to electric fence. The people that have problems are that put animals out there and forget about the fence. You check it every day. If it's down, you find out why and you fix it before your animals find out. Because you can train your animals to check it, because getting out is a powerful reward. So if your animals get out once, they'll learn to check the fence, and 5 minutes after it's down, they'll be out. Oh. Miscellaneous small ruminant knowledge. Goats require copper. Sheep require very little copper. Okay, you go to a local farm store and they're well versed that sheep avoid copper with sheep. Copper is toxic to sheep, and they extrapolate it to goats. Wrong. Okay, your small ruminants require some sort of fiber in the diet. You don't feed them just grain. And there's some new producers that make that mistake because the animals sure love that grain. And they just keep feeding them that grain, and then they have acidosis. Okay, the animals are susceptible to coccidiosis, usually due to stress and lack of sanitation. And especially your new animals that are coming in, they'll be stressed by being transported. Okay. And a little bit, some animals are more resistant to parasites or worms than others. And it would be nice if you could check that before you buy your animals. And basically you can't. There are some things with the hair sheep that they're working with on quantitating parasite resistance. But for the most part, most producers don't utilize that program. And so there's always a few animals we're going to have to cull. Okay. You know, I hear producers tell me all about these stories of how they saved this animal. They were up 2 nights in a row and taking the temperature every so often and giving it a shot and giving it electrolytes or whatever. I guess to me, I'm not much of a hero. Let's prevent those problems. Take some planning. Okay, good nutrition goes a long way. That immune system's got to have the nutrients in order to respond like it should. Minimize stress. What stresses animals? Moving them around, transporting them. I think goats are stressed worse than any other animal by being transported. I think it's because they realize that something's really going wrong. Vaccinate your animals. We'll talk basically about vaccinations for your most common diseases. Control your worms because worms kill more goats than the next 3 diseases put together. Worms kill more than the next disease does in sheep. Cull those problem animals. I remember a producer telling me about every animal that, as a lamb, was a problem and they doctored and treated and everything, never grew up to be a good animal. So not every animal is a good animal. We need to get rid of some of them. Some of them are better off as meat. Biosecurity, you can do everything right, but you can bring somebody else's germs in. When you buy someone's animal, they don't tell you about the germs that you're bringing in. They don't tell you about the worms. They don't tell you about the dewormer resistance. So be careful when you're buying animals. Most common thing that we vaccinate for are enterotoxemia, also called overeating, and tetanus. If we have cases lymphadenitis or cheesing gland, we can vaccinate for that. Generally, in animals that have been vaccinated previously, we vaccinate them booster them prior. The lambs or kids will give them vaccinate them prior to weaning and then 4 weeks later. Some people talk about 4, 8, and 12 weeks, giving 3 vaccinations. 2 is probably adequate unless you're really stressing the animals. And from there on, if the animals have been vaccinated as lambs or kids, they need boosted about roughly a month before lambing or kidding. The reason for that is that when you booster them, it mounts a large immune response against what you vaccinated them for, and it goes into the colostrum or the first milk, which provides the lamb or kid immunity to those diseases. Your bucks, you need to booster them annually. You can do them same time you do your does. Abortion diseases, if you're unlucky enough to have an abortion disease get into your flock, there are some abortion diseases that can be vaccinated against. But your vet will have to work with you on those. Just a general production cycle, and people talk about three lamb crops or 3 kid crops in 2 years, or the Cornell rotation where you divide the year into 5 and you get 5 kid crops in 3 years. To start out with, you probably need to work with 1 kid or lamb crop per year, nice and simple, working with Mother Nature, before you go with some of the more challenging scenarios. So if we were to breed around mid-November, we'll vaccinate them, booster them mid-March for whatever we're vaccinating for. We're going to kid about mid-April when forage is available. And I should point out that our time of kidding depends often on our market and on our production cost. If we have a high-value market for show animals that requires them to be born a certain time, maybe it will pay us to kid in February or lamb in February. However, if we don't have an extraordinary market, it's probably better to kid or lamb in sync with grass when we have the grass, because from about 6 weeks before we lamb or kid until about 12 weeks afterwards, when the doe or the ewe is producing very little milk, that's 50% of the nutrients that the animal will consume in a year is consumed in that 18-week period. So the thing we need to do is think about sheep. And sheep is when we have grass. Wean our animals in maybe September time of the year. Do we castrate? Depends on our market, depends on our animals, and depends on our management. And where do we market them? Hopefully we visited some producers and we found out at least some markets then to market our animals. The cost of wintering cattle is the biggest determinant in the profit of cattle. I think the same is true in our sheep and goats, because so much of our out-of-the-pocket costs are due to wintering. Some of the things we can do is we can stockpile forage, or we can use hay. There are some ATRA pamphlets over here about pasture management and forage cycles. We can feed round bales in a hay feeder. Should point out that we need some sort of feeder. Lambs will waste, or lambs are used, will waste a lot of hay. Goats will, people will set a round bale on the end, and the goats will eat it, and it'll look like a toadstool. It'll be precariously balanced there until your most expensive animal gets under there, and that's when it topples and smothers them. It can, the dollar value of the animal just sucks it right over on them. So we need to put it in a hay feeder that'll save our animals and also save a lot of hay. Range cubes, pellets, or whole corn may be the concentrate portion that we use as we need to supplement. We always need to feed an appropriate mineral supplement. An appropriate, if we have hair sheep, we've got to stay away from copper or use a very low copper supplement if we do, depending on a lot of factors. And we can, if we have animal mortalities or we slaughter animals, take a sample of the liver and send it to Michigan Diagnostic Laboratory for a mineral analysis. That can tell you a lot about how your mineral program is working or isn't working, so that you can make corrections. You're going to probably need some supplemental feed in early lactation and some situations, especially your first-time lambers or kidders are likely to need some. But basically, you're going to need to know more about pasture management than you do your animals. I hate to say that, but that's just reality. Getting ready for goats. We talked about visiting other goat producers, auctions, collecting information from the web, extension and producer groups. Now, one thing we haven't talked about is making a business plan and a budget and buying our first animals. Okay, your business plan, write down the reason that you have for having sheep and goats, because when you're having problems, you're going to say, why did I get into this? So write down before, and some people, you know, they just want to get sheep or goats, you know. And then they end up running a nursing home for them. And then wonder why they aren't making money. Plan your production cycle. What time of the year are you going to lamb or kid? Plan your production goals. What are you shooting for? Are you shooting for 2.3 lambs? Are you shooting for maybe 1.5, which that goes back, depends on your forage base and your genetics. You need to develop contingency plans for drought or disease outbreaks. You know, if you plan early for a disaster, then when the disaster happens, you're not so panicked. You can say, oh, I can go back here, I've got this sheet written. Let me pull this sheet out and we'll see what we can, let's go down the line. While all your neighbors are panicking. It's kind of odd, in Oklahoma we have a drought about every 5 to 7 years. Most of your cattle producers act like we've never had a drought before. And you know, something that happens so cyclic, you need to plan for. You know, in some areas that you need to plan for hurricanes. Budget using production cycle and goals. And I should point out I put together a cowboy type budget. I do not know of any goat budgets that are based on actual data. We goat people don't keep records. Actually, there is one on the internet. But how about sheep budgets? Does anyone have a real sheep budget? But that's one of the problems that we have. So, I mean, we've got some places you can start. After the first year, you'll have some better figures. Okay, income, we're going to assume that we wean 1.5 kids per doe, or we can say this budget applies to hair sheep too. And we're going to keep 1/4 of a kid for replacement. We'll say that 25% of our herd is replaced every year. So that allows us 1 1/4 kids to sell. Okay, 5 kids for every 4 goats. Okay, we'll assume that we're selling a 55-pound kid and prices are good. We get $2 a pound. So that gives us an income of about $137. And we're going to sell 2/10 of a coal. We're replacing 0.25 and the difference is 0.05. So that means that we had a 5% death loss, which is probably a generous death loss. It depends on, for starting out, you'll probably lose a few. After you get more experience, you'll lose a lot less. But we get a total income here of nearly $150. Okay, fencing's going to be one of your biggest expenses, and we're going to amortize it over 10 or 20 years. Ironically, half the goat people are out within 5 years. What do you do with the rest of that expense? Pasture, whatever your pasture rent is, and even if you own the land, you need to charge yourself something for pasture. Health costs for vaccinations, dewormers, maybe consult with the vet, and who knows, you will have some sort of problem you'll have to see the vet for, or should see the vet for. It's going to cost you something for that buck or ram to service your animals. Yes, you're going to pay $400 or $500, and maybe he will cover $100 in his lifetime, and then you've got his feed. Replacement cost from the time we wean that replacement until she gets bred, then it's going to cost us some money. Winter feed bill, yes, it's going to cost us depending on how shrewd we are. And minerals and water will cost us something, and people think it costs them nothing. Okay, basically if we take that income there is almost $150. Expenses, if I add up all the low ones, I get $40. If I add up all the high ones, I get $108. So that leaves us a profit between $109 down to $41. Probably reality is $60 to $70 a head. So we're not getting rich, but golly, any sort of agriculture you can finish in the black, you're doing pretty good. So there's great potential for small ruminants. I mean, things are so much better than the cattle industry, where I think it was last year, the ag economist said the average profit on a cow is $15 a head. Okay, purchase from reputable producers. Hopefully you've gone around and talked to producers. You need to talk to a dozen producers before you get into the business. Find some with your type of production system and breed. Select healthy, physically sound animals. Bring a friend that's been in the sheep or goat business when you go to pick out your animals. Expect to pay more than auction price because you're getting better quality animals than at the auction. However, don't start out with the finest animal. It's a lot cheaper to lose a $500 animal than it is a $1,000 animal. In fact, those $1,000 animals are more likely to die than the $500 animals. Start early in locating your animals. Actually, before animals are born, you can talk to producers. Expect more problems with animals bought from the auctions if you insist. I just had a call last week from an experienced cattle and goat producer, cattle, goat, and sheep producer that just couldn't find some sheep at the price he wanted, so he bought some sheep at the auction, and now he's got abortion problems. And you know, the number of lambs he's lost would pay the difference for having bought quality animals. Start small with whatever size you feel comfortable with, 20 or 30 head. Don't bring your 500 head in to start with. Prices for quality animals here, like I said, not sale barn sheep, but don't buy your $1,000 animals either. And how much a ram or buck can serve, so that you'll know then how many of those you need. But start small to get some experience. Find sources of feed and other supplies wherever you can. Locate hay, feed and hay. That's a problem a lot of goat producers have, and sheep producers. When you have a small herd of 20 or 30, or a lot of them will like small bales, they don't have facilities to handle large bales, and that's a problem. Sometime if you start early, a producer will bail you up some small bales, especially. You can often buy vaccines and dewormers from mail order places. Only buy what you have to. Get prepared before you get goats. A fella called me, says, I got those brought some goats home from the auction, and I put them in my trap. And he said, next thing I did, when I looked up, they were out of the fence. Golly, a 5-strand barbed wire doesn't hold goats. Predator control, have you a plan in place? You know, if those coyotes never taste how good sheep or goats are, there's no real strong incentive for them to cross electric fence. Have some waters and feeders. Have some plans on vaccination and deworming. You need some minimal handling facilities, which you can make out of some cattle panels or goat panels, T-post and baling wire. Coccidiosis prevention is important. But in conclusion, first you need to get informed, then you need to do some planning. You need to get ready before you get your goats or sheep.